I am on the policy team for Deputy Commissioner Philip Gilman, and I have had the great privilege of working with the Housing Choice Voucher Division Director, Wakel Hawley, and her leadership team, including Ryan Smith, over the last several months in launching a new round of project-based vouchers. So as you all know, we're going to spend today talking about what project-based vouchers are, what the benefits they can provide are for your community and for your properties. And then we'll also take time to talk through the application process for different types of properties. DCA has tried to be really intentional and clear about who will qualify for what type of process. And so I'm sure many of you might have questions about the initial documents that we provided. And we want to make sure to cover that so you get all of those questions answered today. We also want to take time to cover the due diligence process. So that's going to be what will happen post-award, right? So that means anything that is going to be after we have awarded these properties. And that means our housing choice or our housing quality standards inspections, our subsidy layering review, right? And so we want to be clear on our side of the expectations that it'll take to actually get these contracts signed and get payments started. So if we have time at the end, we'll walk through some scenarios of what different property types and qualifications might look like in terms of the process they have to go through. But if we don't have time for that, we will push straight to questions. And all of this information will be provided on that same DCA website link that you were able to sign up for this meeting at. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Wakel and Ryan, and they're going to give you guys an overview of project-based vouchers, their value add, and talk through some of the frequently asked questions that we hear from properties interested in working with the Housing Choice Voucher Program in this way.
Hey, good morning. My name is Ryan Smith. So to cover the project-based vouchers are part of our Housing Choice Voucher Program. We are in a contract with HUD, our ACC, where we receive a voucher allocation, and we're able to set aside 20% of our voucher allocation to project-based vouchers. So unlike the tenant-based voucher, the project-based voucher is a form of subsidy that's tied to the unit for at least 1 year, but no more than 15 years. There we go. With the subsidy being tied to the unit, it works very similar to the tenant-based voucher, where the tenant will pay 30% of their adjusted gross income, and the DCA will pay the remainder of their rent from the 30% up to the full contract rent. The landlord and the tenant will be tied or bound by a lease. The tenant and DCA will be bound by the voucher, which is the contract between the tenant and the housing authority. Excuse me. And the landlord and DCA will be under contract through our HAP contract. So the best ways to explain how the voucher can be useful to a property is consistent payment. The tenant, again, is only responsible for 30% of their adjusted gross income to be applied toward their rent, while DCA will pay the remainder. So you're entitled to guaranteed payment from DCA on the first of the month, of course, for our portion, while the tenant is responsible for theirs. For families who do not have income, DCA will pay the full contract rent. It allows for properties to have that consistent and additional income to maintain the property without having that funding shortfall. Of course, you can use project-based vouchers with other subsidy types, such as home and low-income housing tax credits. And it just allows you to offer affordable options in your community to families who do experience low income. All right. So an example for added value with PBVs is that we can increase our payment standard up to 120% of the small area fair market rent. So as an example, if in the zip code 31816, you see the efficiency unit small area fair market rent is $830. If we are able to increase it to 120%, that would increase that contract rent to $996. Of course, the increase by the 120% is also based on comparables in the area. So it is subject to certain rules and criteria for the unit or for the property to meet in order to qualify for those additional rents. I'm sorry, increased rents. I think Raquel's going to take over from here.
Yes, good morning. My name is Raquel Holly. I am the Division Director of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and we're going to discuss on determining how residents are eligible, or more so applicants are eligible for the project-based voucher program. So as our administrative plan presents, is that they have to be low income of less than 80% AMI. Very low income is less than 50%, and extremely low income is less than 30%. 75% of our waiting list must meet extremely low. That is a HUD requirement. As for right now, the DCA ACV program manages the waiting list. However, we're looking forward for HUD putting out the notices to state that LATEC communities or any communities can manage their own waiting list, and we just have to determine eligibility on our end and determine if they're suitable for the program. We also can do leasing in place, for example, an agreement for affordable at 30% AMI. We can turn that particular unit into a project-based voucher unit as long as the unit passes the HQS standards and the applicant who's currently residing in that unit is eligible for the program. So how will your units qualify? First and foremost, they must meet HQS, which is the Housing Quality Standards. As for now, we will go to Inspire, but for right now, we have to follow HQS standards. At least 25% and no more than 25 units and no more than 25% of the units must be up under supportive services. So if we go over the 25% benchmark, we must have an MOU in place to provide the additional services, more so like wraparound services to the families in the community. High quality applicants for properties are in good standing, of course, with DCA. They can be considered for a waiver on a case-by-case situation for 25 unit minimum, depending on the location of the property. The sum of all the properties applying for the PVV will also make it a situation where we can consider for a waiver.
Yeah, and Raquel, I want to jump in here really quick because I know we had gotten questions about this beforehand. And so I want to clarify that our standard for this, of course, will be on a case-by-case basis. But if you're an owner or developer who has multiple properties and the sum of all of those properties that you're applying for is more than 25, then we'll consider your properties for project-based vouchers. But if you're applying with multiple properties and it's less than 25, we won't be able to consider your properties for project-based vouchers. So that's a slight clarification based on the initial feedback that we've given, but the final feedback will be posted online in a Q&A form, as with most funding announcements from DCA. Wanted to clarify.
So how do we determine rents? We go up to 120% of SAFMR, which is a small area fair market rents. A part of that determination is we have to look at the rent comps by nearby properties. And we'll also, if necessary, if we can't get comps, we can use the comparables that the LATEC community have recently done on their particular assessment or appraisal of the property. But nonetheless, I don't want to confuse the payment standards, which is the SAFMR versus how much we'll pay. But it sets the benchmark how much the most amount that we can pay. But if the comparables does not support the maximum amount, then we have to do what's affordable for the area and for the tenant. Payments will begin after the HAP contract is executed and once the unit is, once the tenant, let me rephrase that, has moved into the unit. So with PVV, we execute the HAP contract first, then we find the tenant, then we move the tenant into the property, and then once the tenant moves into the property, of course, after determining eligibility, we then begin to release payment on that particular unit. We also are in the process of reassessing our administrative plan and adding that we will pay vacancy loss, that hopefully that will be in our admin plan sooner than later. And if so, we will inform anyone who's eligible who receive any project-based voucher award. But as of right now, we do not pay vacancy loss. To our jurisdiction, we cover 149 counties out of the 159 counties in Georgia. The 10 other housing authorities cover the other 10 counties that we do not cover. So when you apply, it is imperative that your properties are within 149 counties that we have jurisdiction over. And you can see, I'm sorry, in the map, you'll see the green section, which is the northern region, and more the yellow color is the southern region. So that's more rural, and the green part of the map is more metropolitan.
And just so folks know, I'll be, everyone who's on the call today, I will be providing a follow-up email with several documents, one of which will be this map.
So the application process, of course, is eligible properties submit the application, as Lorianne said earlier, September, October. Then we do the review to see determines which applications qualify and provides preliminary awards. Then we move to the due diligence. We do the environmental, the subsidy layering, the inspection reviews. And as I mentioned, as all that's done, we go into contract and tenants are moved in once eligibility for the unit as well as the tenant is determined.
Thanks, Mikkel. So we're going to talk through each of these 4 process steps in a little bit more detail, so you guys have an idea of all that will be required for each step. So as for our applications, right, this is a little bit more information and discussion on the initial FAQ that we posted about who qualifies through what process for applying for project-based vouchers. So based on HUD's guidance, we have determined different processes for different types of properties. So I'm going to talk through what I'll consider 1 and 3 in a bucket, right? So if you're a property or an owner of properties who have received DCA competitive rewards through financing, right? If that's a housing tax credit, if it's a home award, if it's an NHTF award, if you've gotten one of those in the last 3 years, and that means that your award letter or amended award letter is from 2020 or later, then you will qualify through going through what is going to be an expedited process for project-based vouchers. So these buckets of properties, right, those who have gotten financing in the last 3 years, will have to go, they'll just submit an application. And then after that, we receive that application, we can begin the due diligence process. I want to clarify one piece of this, right? And that's that we can actually not award project-based vouchers to properties that are currently in construction. So that's why you don't see currently in construction properties listed anywhere on the FAQ or on this slide. That is a federal requirement. And so we have to wait until the property is actually ready to move people in. So you've gotten a certificate of occupancy before we can award your property with project-based vouchers, or you haven't yet begun construction. And so I know in our applications, we said that we needed to have properties online by 12/1. And so if you're a property that is going to be online by the end of the year, please still apply and keep in touch with us about when your certificate of occupancy is available so we can evaluate your application and begin the due diligence process at that time. But for all other properties who are already in service or who have not yet begun construction, right, we'll be able to begin due diligence immediately upon evaluating your application. The second group, the second bucket, is anyone who received a competitive award before 2020 or anyone who has not previously received a competitive award from DCA, right? So those folks will have to go through a traditional RFP process, and we'll walk through what we're looking for in that RFP in a couple of minutes. But that process will be just a little bit longer in terms of DCA's evaluation of which properties will be selected. Who doesn't yet have a process, right? Like I mentioned, if you're in the middle of construction, we have to wait until you're finished with construction until we can award you these properties. But please let our housing finance team know if you're interested in project-based vouchers. so we can have that information internally, especially as we work on future allocations. Other people who don't yet have a process, right, are future tax credit applications. And so we'll be in touch if this changes in the future, but we're currently working to interpret some HUD guidance on at what point we can actually include those in our underwriting and subsidy layering review processes. All right, so scoring and selection. So we'll talk about these in two buckets. So like I said, the first and third bucket, those who have gotten a competitive award, whether you've started construction or whether you're in service or you haven't started construction, that application, which is linked online and we'll send as a follow-up, really asks you to cover three things. One, confirmation that you're in DCA's HCV jurisdiction. Two, confirmation through additional documentation that you're in a census tract that meets one of the Housing Choice Voucher deconcentrating poverty standards, and confirmation and documentation that you meet the site and neighborhood standards for the Housing Choice Voucher property requirements. So we've already gotten some applications, and the documentation that was provided is exactly what we're looking for. So basically, anything that you guys have to make sure that we know that you meet those standards is going to be helpful. The second batch, right, the RFP, the competitive process, we have a little over 1,100 project-based vouchers to be able to administer, right? So that means if we, from you guys, get requests for 2,000 2,000 project-based vouchers, we're going to have to do more of a competitive evaluation of the application, right? And so we want everybody that's applying through the second process to meet the threshold requirement. Very similar to what you prove with your LIHTC applications in terms of site control and financial feasibility. We have a couple additional things that we want more information on, especially for management experience, to show that you have experience in affordable housing, either development, property management, or supportive services in Georgia. But basically, these are just what we'll consider threshold requirements. So things you have to meet in order to be considered. If we receive fewer than 1,100 applications, right, these are really the things that we'll be looking for, and we'll be able to administer based on who follows through in the due diligence process. But if we receive requests for more, we'll go into a competitive process. And this is, of course, outlined in the RFP, but really the 5 things that we'll start evaluating on a competitive basis are: 1, owner experience and capability. And this is very similar to the management experience threshold requirement that just gives, if you have a little bit more information, we have some internal standards for how we'll score individuals based on longer experience and more residents served. Financial feasibility. So this section you'll have already covered in your threshold requirements, but if you demonstrate a real value add of project-based vouchers, that's the other competitive piece that we'll evaluate on. So we want to know how you'll be able to serve more residents with project-based vouchers that you otherwise would not be able to serve. The site location standards, right? You'll have already demonstrated the baseline for that in the threshold requirements, but this is a furtherance of the deconcentrating poverty goals, right? You're located in an area that is really, really low poverty rates. You're already an existing LIHTC property that got one of those previous community designations, like you're in a revitalization zone, et cetera. And that will be listed, of course, on our end, on the LIHTC side. And then the other 2 requirements are immediate occupancy, right? We need to know that you're willing to work with us quickly and that you want and that you have property available to be leased now. And then some location pluses. And those location pluses for us are similar to what you might have heard in other programs, but they're going to be making sure that you are in an under-resourced community, right? So if you're in a community without a lot of project-based vouchers, without a lot of other DCA investment, if you're in a high need, high opportunity census tract, and if you, of course, either are approximately located to different services in transit, very similar to our LIHTC requirements, or if you have transit available for people to get to those locations. So that's what we're going to be looking for on the competitive side, should that be needed. I heard a ding. Was there?
Laura Ann, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to answer it now or wait till later.
Yes, let's go ahead and wait until later so we can make sure to get through everything, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. All right, so the initial award timeline. Like I said, if you have received a competitive award, we can start working with you now on the due diligence process as soon as we get your applications. We've already started reviewing the applications that we've received, and we'll be in touch with more information this week. For the existing properties that are going through an RFP process, those applications are going to be due October 10th. And we'll score those over the course of the next week, and then we'll be in touch with the properties who have gotten an initial award to start to begin that due diligence process to finalize the award. So you can expect to hear back from us towards the end of October if you're going through that competitive process. All right, the due diligence process. We want to be completely transparent about everything that's required to get from initial award to contract. And so really there are 4 steps, 4 buckets that we can think about having to complete on our side before we can execute a HAP contract, which is a housing assistance payment contract. The first piece is the environmental review. We'll talk through that in more detail, but that's basically on DCA's side. There's documentation that we have to confirm about your location. Like I said, I'll talk through what those requirements are, but that's an internal certifying process that we wanted to make you guys aware of. The second piece is our subsidy layering review. And that, based on when we received the documentation, can take anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks. And so I don't think our financing team is on the call, but we'll be working really closely with many of the people that you and your partners have already worked with on our underwriting side to do that subsidy layering review process. And I do want to go ahead and flag that we are working closely with HUD on this process, and there is a potential pending government shutdown. So for this and our inspections process, we will continue operating and doing everything on our end to make sure we have the documentation and are ready to go. But our timelines might be impacted by that situation that unfortunately we cannot control. I do want to just pause briefly on that note and let Wakel and Ryan jump in on the internal controls and protections that DCA has in place for our landlord partners in the event that there is a government shutdown on the federal side.
Hey, so, excuse me, for government shutdowns, generally payments stop to a housing authority for operating and housing assistance payments. However, for a healthy housing authority, or DCA in this case, we do have reserves in place where we are able to continue payments during a shutdown. It wouldn't be indefinitely. Hopefully it doesn't stay shut down long enough for it to impact our payments to our landlords, but we do operate with enough reserves to protect our tenants and our landlords from loss of housing assistance payment.
Right, but I also want to add to that, because what Ryan said is definitely true, and we're in a place where we're able to pay the landlords. But in the event the shutdown lasts more than 3 or 4 months, then we will have to reassess on the landlords who was the last to join the program. We will have to determine how we would pay them. We may could pay partial payments, but ultimately the goal is to keep the families housed.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so the next bucket of the process is going to be the inspection process, and we'll talk through that in more detail. I know there were some questions that came up in our initial discussions when we were ideating about this, so we want to make sure you guys have that information. But that can take anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks, depending on whether or not your property's passed, right? And so it'll be really important for you guys to make sure that the units you're selecting are going to pass those housing quality standards. And then the last bucket of our due diligence process is our work with your tenants, right? So making sure that We've got the rent determined, so we'll talk through the documentation we might need for that based on what Raquel and Ryan talked through earlier. But we'll also, at that time, do any kind of lease in place tenant evaluation. So if you're a property that's interested in turning some of your existing residents into those who are living in project-based vouchers, we want to make sure that your selection of that will actually have residents that qualify. And so we'll share information about what that process will look like. All right, so the environmental review. Like I said, this is a DCA internal process, but and if you've gone through another award, right, it's going to be very similar to what you might have done previously. But just so if there are any folks on the call who have not gone through that process, DCA will collect documentation on 3 requirements, right? Making sure you're not in an airport runway zone, right? Making sure that the accident potential is clear, making sure that you've met any requirements for coastal barrier resource protection and flood insurance requirements. And we'll store all of that internally and certify it through the processes that HUD has determined. So that is our very first step before we can begin anything else. We'll work internally to figure out if you've already provided that information to our other teams and then store it ourselves. But we might reach out and request additional information on mitigation steps as needed. So make sure to have a responsive email address listed in your application. All right, the next step is our subsidy layering review, right? And this will be an additional subsidy layering review on top of what you might have done in the past with our underwriting team. So this is a requirement for the project-based voucher program to make sure that as the property currently exists, right, and the value that it has, it's not receiving too much government assistance. And HUD has lots of guidance out there that you can read about this subsidy layering review process for project-based vouchers. But in general, the 2 standards that they're looking to make sure that properties meet is a debt coverage ratio between 1.1 and 1.45. And if you've worked with us in the past, you know how we typically calculate those debt coverage ratios. And then cash flow that's not exceeding more than 10% of your operating expenses. And so as you're looking at your property portfolios and figuring out which properties might successfully go through a subsidy layering review, make sure those properties are going to meet these 2 requirements before you apply. For the subsidy layering review process, for project-based vouchers, HUD requires some additional documentation that might be unfamiliar for some of our LIHTC folks. So I wanted to flag that. We, of course, will have the project description through the application, but some additional things that are going to be new that won't be existing in your file that we'll need are an appraisal report from the last 6 months, which we'll talk about in a second, and the HUD Form 2880. And I'll send that through as part of the follow-up email so you can see what that looks like. If you're a new property that hasn't previously gone through DCA financing, we'll need all of these documents from you guys in order to conduct the subsidy layering review process. And this has to be done before we can do inspections, rent determination, any of the later steps. On the appraisal, so we understand on DCA's side that this can be an expensive and timely endeavor for you guys and our properties. And so we're working internally and with HUD to figure out exactly what this looks like. But I wanted to flag for you guys that if this is a barrier to you applying, please don't let it be. We are wanting to work with our properties and are wanting to figure out a solution to move forward and have some conversations currently happening. But if you already happen to have an appraisal from the last 6 months of the current value, go ahead and include it and we can move forward with the project-based voucher subsidy layering review. All right, so the housing quality standards inspection. I have this form on the page to show you what a self-inspection checklist looks like, right? So these are all of the things that our inspectors are going to be looking for, and we'll send this again as a follow-up email to all those who are on the call. But like Raquel said, we are currently using the housing quality standards inspection through basically the end of next year. So the whole round of project-based vouchers for this term will go through our housing quality standards inspectors. If you happen to be a new property who has had your individual units inspected through our GHFA inspectors, right through the UPCS process, that inspection can still qualify as long as it was done on the actual unit that you're going to be turning into project-based vouchers. So just be in touch with us if you are one of those very few, very new properties who's looking at these project-based vouchers, so we can confirm if those will qualify. For lease in place units, I want to make everybody aware that our HUD requirements require us to give at least 15 days notice to any tenant in a currently occupied unit before our team goes out to inspect those properties. And we want to make sure that you guys are accounting for that, right, in our partnership. So if you guys say that we're going to inspect a certain unit, we have to wait at least 2 weeks and 1 day before we can actually go out to that unit. And then if that unit doesn't pass, we have to wait an additional 30 days for you guys to make the improvements before we'll then be able to notify the tenant again and then come out in that 15 days to inspect. So that's how that process can end up taking a longer period of time. And it's better if you guys work with us and make sure that the units that you're applying for project-based vouchers actually are going to meet those housing quality standards inspections. Our plan is to do these in late October and November, depending on applications that we get in. So we are working closely with our housing quality standards inspection team, which is a team of 15 plus people, to make sure that we've got those inspections covered across the state. All right, so I just saw a question come in on rent determination. And so I'm glad we're now on this section, right, about how to determine that the tenant and the housing assistance payment contracts are to everyone's agreement in the negotiating process. So for rent determination, as Raquel already said, we will pay up to 120% of the small area fair market rent, but we will also need to conduct our own internal analysis of the reasonable rents in the area. That will include, of course, working with our housing finance team on the determinations that they have made on any LIHTC properties. And in the event that there is a discrepancy between what you've requested as the payment and what DCA's internal analysis has, we will ask you to submit additional documentation if that analysis differs, right? So this is a negotiating process as part of the HAP contract, so we want to have continued conversation with you guys, but want you to be aware we will conduct our own analysis, we'll work with our internal partners, and we'll also need you to provide more documentation as needed. I hope that answers that concern and is clear. So we will outline what the rent is set at in our housing assistance payment contract, and those payments won't begin until after the contract is executed and after the tenant is in the unit. So let's say that you execute your housing assistance payment contract on the 20th of the month for a unit that already has a tenant in place. We would then pay you on the 1st of the month, but it would be prorated for that 10 to 11 day period from the 20th to the 1st. And then you would receive your next full payment on the 1st of the next month. So basically, we will prorate payments for the lease in place process. As Raquel said, we're exploring vacancy payments, so we will be in touch with more details there. The lease in place eligibility verification. So this process is also something that can be a hurdle for our properties who are wanting to lease tenants who are already in units. And so we wanted to be clear and provide you guys with all of the information as you're selecting which units to apply for, so that the tenants you can confirm are going to be eligible for our program before you even apply. This process in general can take up to 60 days for us to actually get all of the documentation needed. And so it'll be really helpful if you guys as the property managers and owners can help facilitate getting this documentation from your tenants. We will provide these forms and documents in advance. It'll just be a draft version, right? Not official, because this is the same eligibility that is a part of our Housing Choice Voucher waitlist. But we want to be clear for you guys to be able to make sure that the tenants are going to qualify. So this list, don't worry about taking a screenshot or anything. It will be in an email. All right, so y'all have heard me talk for probably about 20 minutes. And so I'm going to pass it over to Raquel to talk through what the post-award process will look like in terms of waitlist management.
So at this point, we can assume that the applicant or the tenant is now currently in the unit. But in the meantime, it's safe for the tenant is deciding to move out or the unit becomes vacant for whatever reason. As Lorianne was stating, we are currently not paying vacancy loss, but in the future we do plan on paying the vacancy loss. But what would happen is you would notify us to let us know that your unit is vacant. We would then go to our waiting list and select names in the order that they applied, of course. And we would notify them to say, hey, you've been selected for the waiting list. Do you want to reside in this property? They have 15 days to respond in regards to their interest in residing in your particular property. If they elect to say yes, then we go through the eligibility process. We send the names over to you all. You all do the suitability property screening, and then we begin the process of doing our eligibility. And if once we determine them eligible, we execute what we call the Statement of Family Responsibilities and the tenancy addendum, which will start the HAP payment. However, if the applicant or the tenant states that they are not interested, then we remove their name from the waiting list and we go to the next name. For leasing in place, it's a little bit different if they're moving in, if we're going into the initial HAP contract. As I mentioned before, we have to determine eligibility of the tenant, and of course, the unit has to pass inspection. But if they're already in the unit and they have resided in the unit for 1 year, then they can either receive a tenant-based voucher or they can remain in the unit and we will continue to pay HAP. However, if they decide to move before that 1 year or they move after the 1 year and they do not want a tenant-based voucher or they don't want to move to another unit within the property, if one is available, then we would pay vacancy loss and then we provide you with a new tenant and it goes through the whole selection waiting list process.
Okay, great. So it looks like we have a few minutes before we can go through questions, but we'll talk through some scenarios. I'll get Ryan to jump in and help me with this so you guys don't get too tired of my voice. So Ryan, do you want to take scenario 1 and then I'll jump in for maybe scenario 3?
Sure. So we have an existing property with a 2020 LIHTC award who requests 25 PBVs out of the 100 units that are already occupied. So DCA will approve the request and begin the due diligence process. DCA will confirm the environmental review compliance. At that point, we would move on to the rent determination process. The applicant will submit the subsidy layering review documentation, and DCA will work with HUD to perform the SLR. Once the review is complete, DCA will conduct the inspection. DCA will assess the lease in place eligibility, and then the HAP contract is signed and executed, and payments will begin once the contract is executed and the documents are signed with the tenants. All right, scenario 2 is an existing property requests 25 PBVs out of 100 units that are already occupied. Sorry, 1 second. DCA will evaluate the competitive proposals. If the scoring is favorable, the due diligence process will begin. DCA will confirm the environmental review is in compliance. DCA will then, DCA and the owner will begin the rent determination process. The applicant will submit the subsidy layering review documentation, and DCA will work with HUD to conduct the subsidy layering review. Once the review is complete, DCA will conduct the inspection. DCA assesses lease in place eligibility. The HAP contract is signed and executed, and the payments will begin after the contract is executed and the tenants sign their statement of family responsibilities and their tenancy addendums.
All right, so if you're an existing property that wants 25 out of 100 units to be project-based vouchers, but they're not yet occupied, right? The things that are added here are going to be towards the end. And I think that's where we're getting most of the questions in the chat too. So of course, you'll go through the competitive process, initiate all the initial due diligence from environmental review, rent determination, subsidy layering review, and inspections. But then in terms of the waitlist management, DCA would then notify our waitlist recipients who have said that they're interested in project-based vouchers, that they've been selected, and that individual would then have 15 days to express interest. If they did not express interest, did not respond or said no, then we would go to the next individual on the list and they would have 15 days. And then at some point, the individual would select that they were interested. They would work with you all for property screening and lease signing, while we already know that those individuals would be eligible for our program because they're already on the project-based voucher wait list. So the minute that you guys sign that lease with them, we would be able to finalize the HAP contract. Scenario 4, say you're a new construction property and you want 10 project-based vouchers in a 100-unit property, and let's say 20 in a 50-unit property. We would be able to begin the due diligence process as soon as we confirmed your application qualified. And after we confirmed the environmental review compliance, what the expected rent determination would be, and the subsidy layering review, at that point, you could begin construction. So for these new construction units, we really expect to have a continued conversation with you guys about your construction timelines, so we can make sure that our due diligence process is completed before that construction process begins. Once construction is complete, right, then we would complete the inspection. At that point, we'll probably be on the new Inspire standards, and that is going to be the same standards that are done with all LIHTC inspections as well. So the inspection process will probably be a little bit quicker to schedule. And then once that inspection is complete, we would then begin that waitlist management process, right? So we would notify the tenant of the opening. They would have 15 days to express interest. If they did express interest in that 15-day period, then you all would begin your screening and lease process with the individual, and then we would execute the HAP contract. All right. So thanks so much for your time. We've got 13 minutes for questions. So we'll go ahead and start with the very first question that we got, and then go through to the rest of the questions in the chat before we open it up for verbal questions. So John, can you help me with this process and make sure that I'm answering the question based on the slide it was asked on?
Sure. Yeah, the first question, do you want me to read it out loud, or do you see it in the chat?
Yeah, read it out loud if folks are just listening.
Okay, so the first question was from Amanda. If we apply as a management company with several properties, is the 3-year measure based on each property's award or the last time the management company was awarded?
Amanda, that's a great question. It has to be based on each individual property. So in that instance, the property that you guys received the award in the last 3 years would be able to begin the due diligence process, but the other 2 properties would have to go through the competitive process.
Yeah, and if you ask a question and we provide an answer and you still have a follow-up, you're welcome to sort of like, I mean, is that okay, Laura Ann, just to come off mute and like ask any clarifying? Yeah, we want to make sure we actually answer the question. So, so Amanda, feel free to jump in if you have any additional follow-ups. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. So Nick asked the question about rent determination, and you kind of went directly into that on your slide, Lauren, but I'll ask the question anyway in case there's any follow-up needed there. It sounds like the rent determination is largely subject to DCA's discretion. Is there data that DCA can share regarding the rents that have been approved for other projects which have participated in the program in the past?
We can look internally to see what data that we can share. I will say for our new LIHTC partnership, this is very new, right? So we haven't had the same internal partnership with our LIHTC properties in the past. And so really that documentation that you all use as part of your underwriting process with our LIHTC team is going to be the best source for us internally to figure out what the rents are going to be. Raquel, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there.
No.
Okay, great. Next question is from Amanda again. Are units fixed or floating?
Raquel?
Fixed. They're fixed units. They're not floating units.
And that's partially because of the housing quality standards inspections, right? So like if all of your units are going to pass the housing quality standards inspection, then yeah.
Okay, so next question. What needs to happen before vacancy payments can start being processed?
We have to first make an attempt to get the unit filled, which is the pulling of the names of the waiting list. If we are not successful in selecting anyone from the waiting list, then we allow the property to refer names to us from their waiting list. If the property is not successful, then at that point we can pay vacancy loss. But it's not, it goes in perpetuity, of course. It goes and we're going to put a time frame, maybe it's 30 days, 60 days of how much vacancy loss we're going to pay, because the goal is to get the unit filled as soon as possible.
And on DCA side, our administrative plan process, if the update is approved, would happen this fall. So you can be on the lookout for those board updates if that vacancy payment process is approved.
Okay. Thanks, y'all. Amanda asks another question. How long does this process usually take? Is there a period of time we must wait and then we rent to someone without a voucher if there are no applicants?
No, as long as that unit is part of a PVV HAP contract, you cannot rent to a non-PVV applicant. And the process normally should take approximately 30 days. Well, I'll say 15 to 30 days with viable candidates.
Okay.
But I want to add, if the unit remains vacant for 180 days, we will have to remove the unit from the HAP contract. And then at that time, you can then rent it to a market renter.
Okay, so you may have just answered the question from Sean, which is, what is the typical timeline from start to finish between residents?
Regarding what process? The applicant, or if they're already a tenant?
Yeah, this is Sean. Thanks. Yeah, happy to. I was more so curious about for if there is a resident who is under contract living and they move out, what is the typical timeline for one DCA to go to their housing wait list to select the next applicant, and then should that applicant, they have a 15-day, I think, response time. And if they do respond, then what is the timeline for the next steps in that process?
Right.
And,
so
and what is typical? So is it typically a 30-day process? Is it a 100-day process? What does that look like?
So the goal is for the property to give us a little notice saying, hey, we know this particular unit is getting ready to come, become vacant. And once we know that, then we'll begin to start selecting names from the waiting list to try to get ahead of the time frame. But if that doesn't happen, it typically takes 30 to 45 days to determine eligibility, which is based on us getting all the required documentation from the applicant to determine their eligibility. And then we have to send them over to you all for you all to determine if they're suitable, because we have two different criteria, of course, to make sure that they meet the criteria for the particular unit. And if so, once they're past the criminal background check on our end and eligibility on our end, and they meet your criteria, then we can go ahead and move them into the unit. Of course, this is based on the unit being already inspected. So if the unit has not been inspected, we definitely would get it inspected at the onset of learning that the unit is vacant, so we can go ahead and be ahead of the curve on that. So it typically takes 30 to 45, no more than 60 days for this entire cycle.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, and our last question so far, but keep them coming in because we have a few minutes left. So is from Thompson. The selection priorities refer to competitively awarded projects. While both 9% and 4% LIHTC projects are now competitive, many of the 4% projects awarded since 2020 were non-competitive. Is the intent to exclude these 4% projects, or will DCA include these in eligibility for priority number 1?
Great question. Unfortunately, the word that we chose in competitively awarded was intentional. So if you had a 4% deal that was not a part of a competitive process, then that will need to go through existing process number 2, the competitive RFP.
That's it for the questions in the chat so far. So yeah.
I have one additional question. So someone from our compliance team had mentioned that under federal utility allowance rules, when there's project-based funding, we're required to use the utility allowance methodology that is applicable to those units. And is there going to be flexibility on the utility allowance methodology for these units?
Is there, Sean, as a follow-up, is there concern with the current administrative plan guidance from DCA around our utility allowance?
I think the concern is, for example, if you're using alternative utility allowance methodologies like a energy consumption model or something of that nature, but the DCA project-based units are intended to use a different utility allowance methodology, then the utility allowance methodology on the entire property would have to conform to those units, which would change the rental amounts for the existing units at the property. And so clarification on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, well, Cal, let's work internally, and maybe we can talk to Tommy about that before we provide a response.
I think I'm a little, I'm hearing his questions, but I want to make sure I'm clear before we leave the call. Are you asking, could we conform to the property's utility allowance methodology, or could DCA ACV program become a little bit more flexible in regarding considering your methodology?
I mean, I guess that to me that kind of the same question. I mean, it's can DCA's project-based units conform to the property's existing utility allowance methodology?
No, you can't.
And then what utility allowance methodology would be used?
The utility methodology that will be used will be the methodology that we put in place. We have a third party who go out and do our assessment to determine the utility allowance for the different type of structures that we manage under this program. And then he comes back with his study, and that's the information that we use.
Okay. I think just having additional information on that and providing clarity on what that looks like, I think would be helpful.
Sean, this is Tommy. And I think Laura Ann spoke to this. Wakel and I and Laura Ann will circle up internally, but I see what your concern is because you got a couple of methods you can use for Section 42 compliance. And what you don't want to do
Right.
is have different methods for different, because it's going to invalidate one or the other, right? So, or could potentially do that. So we'll circulate internally, but I think in order to receive what the vouchers from the HCV program, you're going to have to comply with the requirements there, is what Kel's saying. We'll look internally and see if we can clarify some of that to ensure compliance on both sides, Section 42 and HCV, if possible.
Sounds great. Thank you.
So it looks like we got one more question. I'll just jump in and read it here. So back to the floating versus fixed question posed above. If a property is already part of DCA's portfolio, home, debt, or LIHTC award, would DCA consider using a floating unit concept for the HAP? These properties have to maintain HQS inspire physical standards at all times, and 100% of the units should be able to pass the HQS inspection within the inspection timeframe.
Yeah, Zach, thanks for this feedback and idea. In our current process and current administrative plan, that's not possible. But we will, like with the previous question, we'll take that back to our team for further discussions on future rounds. All right, well, we're right at 12. So if you have further questions, I'm going to drop the email in the chat for you to send those questions to. If you can get me your questions by the end of week so we can post all of the information we covered today on the DCA website publicly, then that would be great. Thanks again for your time, and we really hope that we'll be able to partner with you in getting project-based vouchers across the state to improve affordability options for Georgians. Bye, everybody.